Awesome. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. No rush. Take your time. We're going to start in about 20 or 30 seconds. Feel free to grab your cup of tea, grab your cup of coffee, get settled in. Also, thank you so much to those of you who joined us last month. We had a really great discussion with Sudarshan, kind of talking about defending that cloud perimeter. This month, though, I'm really excited to have Andre back on. For those of you who joined us when he was first on, he walked us through this kind of mentality of really thinking like a threat actor. He's got some really great background and experience, and he's going to walk us through today kind of how threat actors might actually abuse these short-term credentials in AWS. So without further ado, Andre, why don't you take a moment and introduce yourself to everyone?
Hey everyone, thanks for having me, Jeremy. Hey, my name is Andre. I've been with Uptycs around 6 months. Prior to Uptycs, I was with AWS for around 5 years, working overseeing their account takeover division. Here at Uptycs, I am part of the cloud security team.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andre. Really excited to have you on again. For those of you on this call who I haven't met yet, I'm Jeremy. I am a technical product marketer here at Uptycs. Prior to Uptycs, I worked at Deloitte doing day-to-day security engineering for government clients. And yeah, in my spare time, I enjoy playing and watching soccer. So we got a lot of fun stuff today. So I'm really excited to walk you through it all. We already kind of covered this introduction section, but we're going to break down the webinar into 3 main sections here. The first one's going to be really this background piece on what are temporary credentials. We want to start from square one, get everyone on the same page, and really make sure that we understand what is this kind of underlying glue for your AWS infrastructure that seems to be these short-term access keys. Then we're going to move on to the second section, which is going to be kind of thinking like a threat actor again, of understanding how do attackers actually abuse these credentials? What's kind of the malicious intent here? And then finally, we're going to go into the solution stage. We don't want to just bring up pain points. We want to really talk about how are we thinking about these tools? How are we building tools? And that's where Andre is going to do this great job of walking us through the UI and kind of understanding how we even think about architecting these solutions. Of course, we have time at the end for an open Q&A. So feel free to use the Q&A button down below, ask questions along the way. And if you're watching this back later after it's been recorded, feel free to drop us an email if you have any questions after. We love talking about this stuff. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So in this background section, I just want to start on full square one here, Andre. Just what is a temporary credential in AWS?
Good question. Just as the name implies, a temporary credential is temporary. AWS has several ways to generate credentials for an AWS environment. One of them is temporary credentials. The opposite obviously is long-term credentials. And what we mean by that is a key for long-term credentials and an Asia key for temporary credentials.
That's awesome. So why are these temporary credentials needed? How are they generated? Yeah, I'm curious what kind of use cases we see around them.
There's actually several use cases for the need for temporary credentials. In fact, AWS Security Best Practices recommends using something called an IAM role. An IAM role is an entity that has a permission policy attached to it, but it is allowed to acquire credentials from the STS service, which we'll get into a little bit later. But the use cases for it is, several. I'll touch on some of them. When you need an identity like EC2 Lambda to make requests to an AWS service like S3 or DynamoDB, you need to allow EC2 or Lambda the permission to write or read to those services. Another use case would be if you have external parties or applications that need to access your account for various reasons, you can provide them with temporary credentials to access those. An example would be an auditor or a mobile app that's accessing reading or writing to an S3 bucket. And then more recently, IAM roles anywhere. If you have on-premise machines that need to access your AWS environment, that's one way to do it. And then lastly is a way to apply an extra security measure to an IAM user. So if they need to apply MFA codes, you can use temporary credentials in addition to the code to be able to call this particular API.
No, that's really helpful. And I think it's kind of fun having you walk through those different use cases and seeing that it's not just machines that might be using these temporary credentials, it's humans and machine identities that might be using them. One question just to kind of break this down even further is, we've talked about this before where it seems these short-term credentials are kind of this underlying glue and they're kind of invisible and they're hard to see. And I'm kind of hopeful that you can kind of explain the difference between short-term versus long-term credentials and that why piece of the ubiquity of credentials. Why do we see this everywhere?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, the best practices from AWS security is to use temporary credentials. And because they're used so often, they actually fly under the radar, so to speak. What I mean by that is they're not in your face. They're not in the console when you log in. It's not easy to see these credentials. But, at the end of the day, a temporary credential is used across applications, across users. And, unless you know CloudTrail really well or Athena, it's very difficult to go in and actually identify what these credentials are doing and whether or not they exist.
No, that's a good segue. And you mentioned CloudTrail and Athena, and I'm wondering, can you just touch on for a moment, you mentioned these Asia keys and these IKEA keys, and Asia keys are kind of these short-term access keys and IKEA keys are the long-term access keys. If they're not really in your face and they're a little hard to track, how do we go about kind of tracking these through CloudTrail logs or whatever method we might do?
Yeah, definitely. So as I mentioned, Asia, what I mean by an Asia key is an IKEA key is every access key is made up of a access key and a secret access key on the long-term credentials. The long-term credentials access key will begin with AKIA. On the short-term credentials, it'll begin with ASIA. Now, the difference with the short-term credential is it'll have the access key, secret access key, and the token. And the token is really what determines the validity of those temporary credentials.
No, that's wonderful. And thanks for really kind of breaking down what those temporary credentials are, where we see them and why we see them in a lot of ways. And now that we've kind of built that foundation, I want to talk about how are attackers actually using this? What's the abuse aspect of these short-term credentials? And where's that fear factor stemming from? So one of the first things is obviously we talk about this persistence aspect. I'm curious, how is persistence achieved where once an attacker gets in, how do these credentials become malicious or abused?
So what a threat actor will do is they will find a set of credentials, use those credentials to make API calls into an account. From there, they will look for ways to stay in an account and persist. And one of those ways is to find those temporary credentials by assuming a role. When you assume a role, that role acquires the temporary credentials from the STS service, which is a secure token service that AWS has for requesting temporary credentials. But what threat actors will do is find credentials and then using those credentials to find another set of temporary credentials, using those temporary set of credentials, find another set of temporary credentials. Again, the credentials are temporary, so there's a validity to these credentials, anywhere from 15 minutes to 36 hours. So as a threat actor, they could actually automate this. They could create a Lambda function that every 20 minutes or every 20 hours will be able to create these temporary tokens, temporary credentials, which will allow them to persist. And again, the difficulty here is temporary credentials are not in your face. They're not visible clearly in the console to the end user or an administrator.
No, that's really helpful. And I know we'll talk about kind of bringing out that visibility of the short-term access credentials in the remediation section. But I really want to break down a little further how that assume role operation works and how that function works. So I know this is just an example of, one account kind of assuming the role of another account here with Alice assuming a role. Maybe you can walk us through this diagram of just kind of, a single use case of someone assuming a role and what that danger is for this somewhat benign function on the surface, but is really kind of a dangerous function when you really look at it.
Yeah, definitely. So as you mentioned, right, we have two accounts, dev and prod. Alice is in the dev account and she needs to access the production account. So what will happen is there will be a role in the production account that is a trust policy that allows Alice to assume it. Once Alice assumes that role, those temporary credentials are returned to Alice. Those credentials, like I mentioned, could be valid for 15 minutes to 36 hours, depending on what the policy states. Using those credentials, Alice now accesses very specific resources in that account. Again, the role will have a policy that determines what Alice can and cannot access. Now, where this becomes a challenging issue is if a threat actor were to have gained access to Alice's credentials, they could mimic Alice and assume the role in the account. Using those permissions or those credentials, the actor could then sniff around to say what other roles are in the account and am I able to assume those roles? And if there were an additional role in the production account, that actor could assume that secondary role using the first role they assumed, and that would be role chaining, staying persistently in the account to be able to then try and move laterally, escalate privileges, exfiltrate data, whatever their desired outcome is.
No, that's wonderful. And you mentioned that term role chaining. So I really want to hone in on that now. The last slide had a nice diagram showing just kind of Alice assuming one role. But I'd love for you to kind of walk through here this idea of someone consistently assuming different roles to almost persist in your environment, maybe indefinitely, depending on how well you can unveil their movements. So maybe walking through this slide a little bit of this different role assuming A and B and C and chaining them together in that way.
Definitely. So, on the right-hand side, let's just start there, right? And as I mentioned, role A, a role, assuming role B in the previous slide. But you could have this loop of multiple roles assuming other roles, or multiple times, I should say. That action or behavior will generate a new set of Asia keys. Trying to identify that in your console, in your the user interface you're using is very, very challenging. So as a threat actor, the ability to get to the diagram on the right-hand side is the crown jewels, because that gives them that infinite ability to persist within an account. If we look at their diagram on the left-hand side, right, we have 4 different accounts, and as you can see, dev account will be able to, the identity account users can assume a role in the dev account. They can also assume a roles in security account and the production account. As a threat actor, being able to find that niche or crack and understanding which roles can assume which is what they're after. Once they get that and they can assume multiple roles, they have that persistence across one or many accounts.
No, that's really helpful. And I think kind of just looking at this diagram, it becomes clear where this problem lies. And part of the solution set I want to talk about now is how can we actually detect what is normal versus abnormal, what's anomalous, and how do we bring out that visibility from something that's generally just running in the background? So I'd love for you to kind of spend a moment talking about how we think about our security tooling in this sense. And then I'd love for us to kind of get into the UI itself and really walk through. So I'm happy to kind of let you take over and screen share. But before we do that, how do we kind of begin even thinking about tooling to track these short-term credentials and really detect this abnormal movement?
Yeah, so you've got to know what you're looking for, right? And you've got to be able to stitch together. For example, when role A assumes role B, that generates a second set of Asia tokens. Those Asia tokens assume a different role. That's a third set. We call it a parent-tree relationship, right? So the parent of a role, for example, could create a new set of credentials. From those new set of credentials, how many hops can they go, and how many of these different sets of credentials could they actually create? But let me take over sharing, and then I'll show you what I mean. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, feel free to take over.
Okay, give me a sec. Okay, let me know if you can see that.
Awesome. Looks great. Thanks.
Okay, so what we have here is a heat map of Asia tokens. Now, just for folks listening and watching, we are in a beta version. So what you see here is a beta of what we'll be releasing. Some of these names and the features and the way it's structured should be changing. But the gist of it is what you see here is anomalous tokens broken down by day and broken down into 2-hour or 1-hour intervals spaced by 2 hours apart. Now, let's just click on one of these, right? So October 7th, let's have a look here. So here we have 9 different tokens that were created on this day. And if we focus on, let's focus on this one. So this one started off from this IAM role as a parent. And what you can see is it's gone ahead and created multiple temporary tokens. So ending in SW6, went ahead and assumed a role, which then created ending in YXD, which then went on to assume another role ending in DB0, and so forth and so forth. Now, what we do is the reason some of these are green versus red is we will flag to you when anything is beyond 3 hops, 3 or more, we will flag it to you as red. One of the things we didn't touch on, I do want to highlight, typical use case is someone assuming a role one time and then a second time assuming a different role. Most of the customers we speak to in enterprises, that generally or typically is how many times they assume it. So there's 2 Asia keys present. When we see 3 or more, we're going to flag it to you and say, hey, something is going on here. We have an interactive UI. You can drag these around. You can look at them. You can get a sense of what's going on here. But one of the great things we have also is if you select one of these, this Asia key here and say investigate CloudTrail events. Again, this is a beta right now, but you can see which APIs that particular Asia key called. So if that particular Asia key went ahead and called list users, list buckets, it would show up in this particular console.
No,
and then
that's
second,
great.
yep, sorry, go ahead.
No, this is fantastic, and it's kind of fun to be able to dig into it all. I think that's one of my favorite parts about this product and these specific features is that we give you that high level overview of, okay, these are the Asia keys in your environment. These are the ones that are being strung together, but really quickly we can dig in and get that granular level of detail of, okay, what were these Asia keys actually doing? What kind of API calls were they making? So I think it's fun being able to dive into that and see those different layers to the product itself.
Yeah, agreed. And lastly, the last piece I wanted to show is if you're wondering how do you remediate, we're going to have, right now this is still in beta, but we're going to have the CLI command that will allow you to revoke this particular Asia key, its permission. So we'll give you a policy, CLI command that will attach a policy to a particular role so that if it's a nefarious token, you can go in and revoke its permission.
That's fantastic. Yeah, because we don't want to just, say, hey, here's a problem. Kind of arming our security teams with the solutions themselves is really, really important. And that's kind of a nice seamless response to have that CLI command already in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know cloud security is complex, right? So this whole topic of temporary tokens or temporary credentials, how they work, what are they doing, is not an easy thing to wrap your head around. So what we're trying to do is make it as simple and easy for security teams of any size to look at this and say, I now know what's going on, and I can quickly arrive at my conclusion around what do I need to do to resolve this issue if I deem it is a legitimate issue.
No, that's wonderful. I do want to be mindful of everyone's time, though, so I'll go ahead and take it back and share my screen now. If anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in the box below. I've seen a couple come in, so let me go ahead and find those. Yeah, Andre, first off, thank you so much for walking us through the UI. I think you did a fantastic job. And like I mentioned, I think it's really fun to see those layers to the product of kind of unveiling this kind of hidden glue to the infrastructure. being able to see the parent-tree relationship and being able to play around with that graphic as well. But most importantly, those remediation steps, all of this, it's not useful unless you have that takeaway and that understanding of what action can I take next. All right, so I found one of the questions here. Is there ever a time when Asia keys should string themselves together and that would be normal behavior? How would you kind of differentiate between normal and abnormal behavior in that sense?
Yeah, there is a use case. There's several, but one Asia key, or excuse me, let's assume there's a IAM user with an IKEA key, and they assume a role. So they generate the first set of Asia keys. That may be to access an account. Then, when they're in that account, they may need to assume a different role to be able to initiate changes or updates on a select set of services. They would then have to assume a different role, and that's a second set of Asia keys. So they're all legitimate cases. So we will flag those to you. But like I mentioned, if it gets beyond three or more, that's when we believe, based on our inputs and our feedback, that three or more starts getting into the questionable territory that customers should be looking at to say, is this acceptable, legitimate, or is this something else that's going on with my environment?
That's awesome. Thank you so much for walking us through all that. I do want to be mindful of the time though. So any closing thoughts before we let everyone go?
Yeah, I would say just, gaining visibility into temporary credentials is a very, very big challenge. There's several open source tools out there that requires a lot of input and work. But once you understand how temporary credentials are created or acquired, I should say, you should be able to then apply a lens over that really surfaces when these temporary credentials are being used, when they're being generated, who's using them, who's generating them, which role they came from. If you can't get to that layer of depth, you're kind of fingers crossed. Hopefully, things are working in your account. So definitely get the visibility you need and really understand how temporary credentials work, because it may just save you and your business.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Andre, and thank you so much for walking us through it all. I'm really excited about the direction of this specific solution set. Thank you for those of you who joined us on the call today. Hope you have a great rest of your day, great rest of your week. And if any of this was exciting to you or you had any questions that we didn't get to today, definitely feel free to email me, email Andre. We do love talking about this stuff, and we're just coming out with more and more features around it. So if it interests you, definitely feel free to hit us up after. But thank you guys so much. Have a great rest of your day and have a great rest of your week. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.